Paris, January 27th, 1973. The Hotel Majestic stands elegant beneath winter clouds. Inside the ornate hall, diplomats arrange leather folders on polished mahogany. Television cameras line the walls. Reporters clutch notepads, whispering predictions. The world expects this moment to belong to Henry Kissinger and Le Duc Tho, two men who negotiated in secret for months. But at the table sits a third figure, Nguyễn Thị Bình, representing the Provisional Revolutionary Government of South Vietnam. Her presence surprises Western journalists. A woman diplomat from a war zone, educated as a teacher, now signing documents that will end America's longest war. Washington believed military pressure would force surrender. Hanoi believed revolutionary fervor would prevail. Instead, the outcome required something neither side anticipated: patient diplomacy led by someone the world barely knew. This is the story of how one woman's quiet determination changed the course of history. The cable arrived in Washington on a cold October morning in 1971. Secretary of State William Rogers unfolded the telegram from the Paris embassy. The message was brief but significant. The Provisional Revolutionary Government would send Nguyễn Thị Bình as its chief negotiator. Rogers paused. Intelligence files on Bình were thin. Born in 1927 in the Mekong Delta, educated in Saigon, former schoolteacher, later imprisoned by French colonial authorities. Released, she joined the National Liberation Front, rising through political ranks. By 1969, she served as foreign minister of the PRG. The Vietnam War had consumed American policy for more than a decade. From 1965 to 1971, the United States deployed over 2,500,000 military personnel to Southeast Asia. The Pentagon spent approximately $111 billion. B-52 Stratofortress bombers dropped 7 million tons of ordnance, more than twice the tonnage used in World War II. Yet, North Vietnamese forces remained resilient. The Tet Offensive of 1968 shocked Washington. Though militarily defeated, the coordinated attacks across South Vietnam shattered the illusion of imminent victory. Public opinion shifted. By 1970, 73% of Americans believed the war was a mistake. According to Gallup polling, President Richard Nixon inherited this crisis when he took office in January 1969. His strategy? Vietnamization, transferring combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces while withdrawing American troops. Simultaneously, he pursued diplomatic channels. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger began secret negotiations with North Vietnamese representative Le Duc Tho in Paris, starting February 1970. But these talks excluded a critical party, the Provisional Revolutionary Government. Established in June 1969, the PRG claimed to represent South Vietnamese, opposing the Saigon government. Hanoi insisted the PRG participate in any final agreement. Washington resisted, viewing the PRG as a puppet of the North. This deadlock persisted for months. Then came the decision. Nguyễn Thị Bình would lead the PRG delegation at expanded peace talks. Her appointment was strategic. As a Southerner with nationalist credentials predating communist affiliation, she embodied the PRG's claim to indigenous legitimacy. Her gender added another dimension, unexpected in Cold War diplomacy, dominated by military men and career bureaucrats. The first plenary session convened at the Hotel Majestic on January 25, 1969. 4 delegations gathered: the United States, North Vietnam, South Vietnam's Saigon government, and the PRG. Bình arrived in traditional áo đai, the Vietnamese long dress, carrying a leather briefcase. Western photographers crowded around her. The New York Times noted her composed demeanor and intellectual bearing. Le Monde described her as a dignified presence in a room of hardened negotiators. Kissinger's memoirs later acknowledged surprise at Bin's effectiveness. She spoke fluent French, Vietnamese, and some English. Her statements combined revolutionary rhetoric with pragmatic proposals. While Le Duc Tho delivered ideological speeches, Bin focused on specific terms: ceasefire procedures, prisoner exchanges, international supervision mechanisms. The talks quickly stalled. Nixon escalated military pressure, hoping to force concessions. In April 1972, he ordered Operation Linebacker, massive bombing campaigns against North Vietnamese targets. B-52s struck Hanoi and Haiphong. Simultaneously, Washington offered new diplomatic terms: complete American withdrawal in exchange for a ceasefire and prisoner return, without requiring North Vietnamese forces to leave the South. This formula broke the deadlock, but implementation required details. Details negotiated not just between Washington and Hanoi, but involving all parties, including Bin's PRG. Her role would prove more significant than anyone initially anticipated. Paris, March 1972. Spring light filtered through budding chestnut trees along Avenue Kléber. Inside the Hotel Majestic, Another plenary session ended in disagreement. Outside, Nguyễn Thị Bình stood before assembled journalists. Microphones clustered around her. Cameras clicked. She wore a dark dye, hair pulled back, expression calm. A reporter from Reuters asked about the latest American proposal. Bình responded in French, her voice steady. Any agreement must recognize the right of the Vietnamese people to determine their own future without foreign interference. Another journalist from Le Figaro pressed about military conditions. Bình shifted to her prepared statement, emphasizing political rather than military solutions. This scene repeated throughout 1972. While Kissinger and Le Duc Tho negotiated in secret, Bình maintained a public presence. The contrast was deliberate. Washington and Hanoi preferred confidential discussions. The PRG needed visibility. Bin's media strategy served multiple purposes, demonstrating the PRG's relevance, countering the Saigon government's legitimacy claims, and influencing international opinion. Her background equipped her for this role. Born Nguyễn Thị Bình in Bến Tre province, she grew up during French colonial rule. Her father worked as a minor official. She attended Saigon's elite schools, unusual for a girl from the provinces. In 1945, at 18, she joined nationalist movements, opposing both Japanese occupation and returning French forces. Arrested in 1951, she spent 3 years in prison. Released, she taught school while maintaining underground political connections. When the National Liberation Front formed in December 1960, Bình joined. Her education and language skills made her valuable for international work. By 1969, she represented the NLF abroad, traveling to communist capitals and non-aligned nations. Her appointment as PRG foreign minister reflected both political loyalty and demonstrated competence. In Paris, she developed a distinctive approach. Unlike some revolutionaries who embraced confrontational rhetoric, Bình emphasized reasoned argument. She cited international law, invoked the Geneva Agreements of 1954, referenced United Nations resolutions. This style resonated with European audiences skeptical of both American military involvement and communist ideology. The media noticed. Time magazine profiled her in May 1972, describing her as articulate and composed. The Guardian called her the most effective advocate for the Vietnamese Revolution's international image. Even American officials acknowledged her skill. A CIA assessment from July 1972 noted, Madame Bình presents a moderate, reasonable face to Western audiences, complicating efforts to portray the PRG as mere Hanoi puppets. Behind this public persona, Bình worked with other PRG officials on substantive proposals. The organization's delegation included lawyers trained in international law, former South Vietnamese officials who defected, and military representatives. They prepared detailed position papers on ceasefire verification, political arrangements for South Vietnam's future, and procedures for American withdrawal. Their proposals often paralleled North Vietnamese positions but included specific concerns about the South. For instance, while Hanoi emphasized complete American withdrawal, the PRG focused on dismantling the Saigon government's apparatus, while Le Duc Tho demanded recognition of 2 separate zones pending eventual reunification. Bình insisted on the PRG's right to participate in any interim administration. These differences mattered less in early 1972 when negotiations remained deadlocked. Nixon's escalation, including mining North Vietnamese harbors in May, hardened positions. But by October, both Washington and Hanoi moved toward compromise. Kissinger's secret negotiations with Le Duc Tho produced a draft agreement. Its terms shocked Saigon. American withdrawal, ceasefire in place leaving North Vietnamese forces in the south, vague provisions for political settlement. South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu rejected the draft. Nixon, facing re-election in November, needed to demonstrate progress without appearing to abandon Saigon. This created space for the PRG's role to expand. Any final agreement required not just Washington-Hanoi understanding, but arrangements satisfying all Vietnamese parties, including Bin's delegation. November 1972. Paris turned grey under autumn rains. Inside the Hotel Majestic, negotiators reviewed typed pages. The draft agreement Kissinger and Le Duc Tho produced in October required revision. Thieu's objections forced reconsideration of key provisions. Nixon's overwhelming re-election victory on November 7th provided breathing room, but not indefinite time. Nguyễn Thị Bình studied the documents at PRG headquarters on Rue Darro. The draft contained 23 articles covering ceasefire procedures, prisoner exchanges, international supervision, and political arrangements. Article 1 affirmed Vietnam's independence and sovereignty. Article 2 mandated ceasefire within 60 days of signing. Article 4 required complete American withdrawal within the same period, but Article 12 generated controversy. It called for a National Council of Reconciliation and Concord representing 3 segments: the Saigon government, the PRG, and neutralists. This council would organize elections and oversee South Vietnam's political future. The provision satisfied neither Saigon nor the PRG. Thieu viewed it as legitimizing the communists. Binh considered it inadequate recognition of PRG authority. The PRG's position had evolved over 3 years of talks. Initially, they demanded the Saigon government's complete removal before any political settlement. By 1972, accepting that Washington would not simply abandon its ally, they shifted to insisting on equal status in any transitional arrangement. The National Council concept partially met this demand, but left crucial questions unanswered. How would the Council make decisions? What enforcement mechanisms existed? Would the Saigon government's military apparatus remain intact? These details mattered enormously. The ceasefire would leave armed forces from all sides in their current positions. North Vietnamese units controlled significant territory in the south. Saigon's army, equipped and trained by Americans, outnumbered them. Without clear political mechanisms, the ceasefire might simply freeze the military stalemate without resolving underlying conflicts. Binh's delegation prepared amendments. They proposed specific procedures for the National Council, including unanimous decision-making to prevent Saigon from dominating. They insisted on dismantling the Saigon government's military intelligence networks targeting PRG supporters. They demanded provisions protecting political prisoners and allowing the PRG to administer territories it controlled. Meanwhile, Nixon pressured Hanoi to accept modifications satisfying Thieu. In mid-November, talks resumed between Kissinger and Le Duc Tho. The discussions grew contentious. Hanoi resisted changes that might strengthen Saigon's position. Washington needed an agreement, but could not completely abandon its ally. By early December, negotiations stalled again. Nixon made a fateful decision. On December 18th, he ordered Operation Linebacker 2, massive B-52 strikes against Hanoi and Haiphong. For 12 days, American bombers attacked North Vietnamese targets with unprecedented intensity. The campaign dropped 20,000 tons of ordnance. 15 B-52s were shot down. International condemnation was swift. The Washington Post called it savage and senseless. The New York Times termed it terrorism on an unprecedented scale. The bombing achieved its purpose. Hanoi returned to negotiations. On January 8, 1973, Kissinger and Le Duc Tho resumed talks. Within a week, they reached agreement on a revised text. The changes were relatively minor, some stronger language about the ceasefire, clearer procedures for prisoner exchange, slight modifications to the National Council provisions. Critically, the agreement still left North Vietnamese forces in the south and provided no mechanism to remove them. For Binh and the PRG, this outcome was mixed. They gained international recognition through participation in the agreement. The National Council formula acknowledged their political role, but the vague language about South Vietnam's future left room for continued conflict. Whether the peace would hold depended not on the agreement's text, but on the will and capacity of all parties to implement it. On January 23rd, negotiators initialed the final text. The formal signing was scheduled for 4 days later. After 4 years of talks, more than 8 years of American combat involvement, and nearly 3 decades of warfare since Vietnam's independence struggle began in 1945, peace seemed at hand. But those who understood the agreement's limitations knew the struggle was far from over. January 27, 1973, morning light illuminated the Hotel Majestic's facade. Television crews positioned cameras along the entrance. Journalists from 30 countries held credentials. Inside, protocol officers arranged the signing table. 4 leather folders contained identical copies of the agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam. Nguyễn Thị Bình arrived at 9:45. She stepped from a black Citroën wearing a dark owl dye embroidered with subtle patterns. Photographers surged forward. She paused, allowing pictures, then entered the building. The CBS News crew captured her walking through the lobby, flanked by 2 aides carrying briefcases. The ceremony was scheduled for 10:30. 4 delegations would sign, the United States represented by William Rogers, North Vietnam by Nguyen Duy Trinh, the Saigon government by Tran Van Lam, and the PRG by Binh. A separate document, the Act of the International Conference on Vietnam, would be signed by representatives of 12 nations, including France, Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. The agreement's structure reflected months of compromise. 23 articles covered every aspect of ending the conflict. Article 1 affirmed American respect for Vietnamese independence and sovereignty. Article 2 mandated a ceasefire effective 24 hours after signing. Article 3 established procedures for prisoner return within 60 days. Article 4 required complete American military withdrawal in the same period. Article 5 addressed the most contentious issue, the status of North Vietnamese forces in South Vietnam. After intense debate, the final text simply acknowledged Vietnamese armed forces without distinguishing between North and South or requiring any withdrawals. This formulation allowed all parties to claim success while avoiding resolution of fundamental disagreements. The political provisions appeared in Chapter 4. Article 9 established the National Council of National Reconciliation and Concord. Its purpose to promote implementation of the agreement's political clauses, including organizing free elections. The council would consist of 3 segments with equal representation: the Saigon government, the PRG, and neutralists. Decisions required unanimity. This arrangement satisfied no one fully but allowed all parties to sign. Saigon maintained that the council had advisory functions only. The PRG claimed it as recognition of their governmental status. Washington viewed it as a mechanism to delay political questions while achieving military withdrawal. Hanoi saw it as a stepping stone toward eventual reunification under communist leadership. The ceremony began precisely at 10:30. Rogers signed first, using 4 pens that would become mementos. Nguyen Duy Trinh signed next, his expression neutral. Tran Van Lam signed third, his reluctance barely concealed. Thieu had agreed to the ceremony only after Nixon promised continued American support if North Vietnam violated the agreement. Finally, Binh signed, her hand steady, her face composed. Photographers captured the moment, the image of 4 figures seated at the table, signing documents that formally ended America's longest war, would appear in newspapers worldwide. Yet the photograph obscured as much as it revealed. Missing from the frame, the tens of thousands of American troops still in Vietnam who would depart over the next 60 days. The North Vietnamese divisions stationed throughout South Vietnam who would remain. The political tensions that the agreement papered over rather than resolved. After signing, each delegation had delivered brief statements. Rogers emphasized American honor and the return of prisoners. Nguyen Duy Trinh praised Vietnamese perseverance. Tran Van Lam stressed South Vietnam's sovereignty. Binh spoke last in French, her voice carrying clearly. This agreement recognizes the rights of the Vietnamese people to peace, independence, and self-determination. The implementation of these provisions will determine whether this peace endures. Her words proved prophetic. The agreement established mechanisms for monitoring, an international commission of control and supervision with representatives from Canada, Hungary, Indonesia, and Poland. A joint military commission would resolve disputes between Vietnamese parties, but these bodies lacked enforcement power. Their effectiveness depended on cooperation from parties who had spent years fighting each other. By noon, the ceremony concluded. Delegates departed for receptions at their embassies. Television networks broadcast footage globally. In Washington, Nixon addressed the nation that evening, declaring peace with honor achieved. In Hanoi, leaders cautiously welcomed American withdrawal while preparing for the next phase of struggle. In Saigon, many wondered how long the peace would last. Nguyễn Thị Bình returned to PRG headquarters. Aides congratulated her on the successful conclusion. She accepted their praise politely but privately understood the challenge ahead. The agreement ended American combat involvement. It did not end the war between Vietnamese factions. That conflict would determine her country's future, and her role in shaping it was far from complete. January 29, 1973. 2 days after the signing, Nguyễn Thị Bình held a press conference at the Hotel Lutetia, where the PRG maintained offices. More than 50 journalists attended. Binh sat at a table draped with the PRG flag, flanked by advisors. She began with a prepared statement in French, then took questions. A reporter from Agence France Presse asked about the National Council. How would it function given the requirement for unanimous decisions? Binh responded carefully. The Council represents recognition that South Vietnam's political future must be determined by all Vietnamese people, not imposed by foreign powers or any single faction. Unanimity ensures no group can dominate. This requires negotiation and compromise, the foundation of lasting peace. The answer revealed both the agreement's potential and its limitations. In theory, unanimous decision-making protected minority rights. In practice, it provided veto power to each party, making effective governance nearly impossible. The PRG viewed this as acceptable because any alternative would have allowed Saigon to dominate, but it meant the Council would likely become another forum for stalemate rather than a mechanism for resolution. A German journalist asked about territorial control. The agreement left forces in place. Would the PRG administer areas it controlled? Binh's response emphasized sovereignty. The agreement recognizes one Vietnam with territories temporarily divided. As ceasefire takes effect, civilian administration in all areas will be determined through the political process established by the agreement. This formulation avoided acknowledging the reality. 3 de facto zones existed in South Vietnam. The Saigon government controlled major cities and populous regions. The PRG administered rural areas, particularly in the Mekong Delta and Central Highlands. Contested zones shifted based on military activity. The ceasefire froze these divisions without resolving them. An American reporter from the New York Times asked the blunt question, "Did Bin believe the peace would hold?" She paused before responding. Peace requires more than signatures on documents. It requires implementation with good faith. The agreement provides mechanisms. Whether they succeed depends on all parties' commitment to its provisions. Her diplomatic language concealed skepticism shared by many observers. The agreement's durability depended on factors its text could not control. Would Nixon's promise of continued support for Saigon survive American domestic politics? Would North Vietnam and the PRG honor the ceasefire if opportunities for military advantage arose? Would Saigon cooperate with PRG participation in the National Council, or attempt to exclude them? These questions had no immediate answers. The 60-day period beginning January 28 focused on concrete tasks, prisoner return, and American withdrawal. The Defense Department published withdrawal schedules. By March 15, 23,500 American troops remained in Vietnam, down from 48,800 when the agreement was signed. By March 29, the last combat troops departed. Only a small military advisory group and embassy guards remained. Prisoner exchanges proceeded more slowly. The agreement required return of all military captives and civilian detainees. This provision generated disputes. North Vietnam and the PRG held approximately 600 American prisoners, mostly pilots shot down during bombing campaigns. Saigon held tens of thousands of PRG supporters and suspected communists. The PRG demanded equal treatment for political prisoners and prisoners of war. Saigon resisted releasing those it considered terrorists rather than soldiers. International Commission observers documented violations. The PRG reported continued Saigon operations in contested areas. Saigon accused the PRG of infiltrating personnel and equipment. Both sides were correct. Neither honored the ceasefire completely. The pattern established in these early months would persist. Formal commitment to peace accompanied by continued military preparations for renewed conflict. For Nguyễn Thị Bình, this period required constant diplomatic work. She remained in Paris coordinating PRG positions with North Vietnamese allies while maintaining separate identity. Her press conferences continued, emphasizing PRG autonomy, even as observers noted close coordination with Hanoi. She met with European officials, presenting the PRG's vision for South Vietnam's political future. Her effectiveness derived partly from credibility built over years of negotiations. Western diplomats acknowledged her as a serious interlocutor even when disagreeing with her positions. A French Foreign Ministry memo from February 1973 noted, "Madame Bin has consistently articulated PRG positions with clarity and conviction. While representing communist allies, she projects an image of Vietnamese nationalism that resonates beyond ideological boundaries." This reputation served the PRG's strategic goals. By maintaining international presence and legitimacy, Bin helped ensure the PRG could not be dismissed as merely a North Vietnamese creation. Whether this would translate into political power within South Vietnam remained to be seen. But in the diplomatic arena, she had established the PRG as a party that could not be ignored. April 1973, Washington Central Intelligence Agency headquarters. Analysts compiled data on Vietnam's post-agreement military situation. The classified report ran 38 pages. Its conclusions were sobering for those hoping the Paris Agreement ensured lasting peace. The numbers told a complex story. South Vietnamese armed forces totaled approximately 1,100,000 personnel. This included 450,000 regular army troops, 500,000 regional and popular forces, and 150,000 support personnel. Equipment inventories were substantial: 1,400 tanks and armored vehicles, 2,000 artillery pieces, 500 fixed-wing aircraft, and 550 helicopters. This arsenal reflected years of American military aid totaling more than $24 billion since 1954. Opposing forces presented different profiles. North Vietnamese regular units in South Vietnam numbered approximately 150,000 troops, organized in 15 divisions. The PRG's National Liberation Front forces added roughly 60,000 fighters, primarily engaged in guerrilla operations and territorial control. Their equipment was less sophisticated but adequate: 600 tanks and armored vehicles, mainly Soviet-supplied T-54s and PT-76s, 700 artillery pieces, minimal air power. These raw numbers suggested Saigon's advantage, but the CIA assessment noted critical qualifications. American withdrawal removed not just combat troops, but crucial support capabilities. South Vietnamese forces depended on American logistics, maintenance, air support, and intelligence. Without this infrastructure, their effective capability declined substantially. The report estimated Saigon could sustain operations at current levels for approximately 2 years, using existing stockpiles and American aid. Beyond that, sustainability required either reduced operational tempo or continued large-scale American assistance. Congressional sentiment after withdrawal suggested such aid would face growing opposition. Communist forces operated under different constraints. Their supply lines ran through Laos and Cambodia along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, rebuilt after American bombing ended. North Vietnamese industry produced limited military equipment, but Soviet and Chinese aid provided tanks, artillery, and small arms. Unlike Saigon, which required sophisticated logistics for a modern military, communist forces employed simpler systems more easily maintained with available resources. Territorial control remained contested. The CIA mapped 3 zones: Saigon control covering approximately 40% of South Vietnam's land area, but 70% of population concentrated in cities, and the Mekong Delta, PRG control in approximately 30% of territory, mainly rural and mountainous regions, and 30% contested or shifting control. This distribution meant that while Saigon governed more people, the PRG maintained significant territorial presence. Economic factors compounded military considerations. South Vietnam's economy had become dependent on American spending. With 500,000 American personnel present at the war's peak, dollars flowed through military contracts, construction projects, services, and black markets. This influx masked underlying economic weakness. South Vietnam produced approximately 80% of its rice needs, but remained dependent on imported fuel, manufactured goods, and military equipment. The agreement's ceasefire provisions were honored mainly in the breach. The International Commission of Control and Supervision documented 1,300 significant violations in the first 90 days. Most involved military movements, territorial disputes, or attacks on opponent-controlled areas. The Commission lacked enforcement authority. Its reports documented problems without resolving them. For Nguyễn Thị Bình and the PRG leadership, these statistics shaped strategy. They could not match Saigon's military equipment, but they did not need to. The agreement's key achievement from their perspective was removing American combat power while leaving North Vietnamese forces in place. Time favored the revolutionaries if they could sustain operations, while Saigon's American-dependent military deteriorated. Political provisions remained largely unimplemented. The National Council of National Reconciliation and Concord existed on paper, but never functioned effectively. Preparatory talks to establish it stalled over procedural questions. Saigon insisted the council had purely advisory status. The PRG demanded substantive decision-making authority. Without agreement on the council's powers, it never convened in meaningful form. This failure was predictable. The Paris Agreement created mechanisms for peace without requiring either side to abandon fundamental positions. For Washington, this allowed honorable withdrawal, a fig leaf covering abandonment of its ally. For Hanoi and the PRG, it removed American military power while preserving their forces and political claims. For Saigon, it promised continued American support without confronting the reality that such support would inevitably decline. By mid-1973, these dynamics were clear to informed observers. The peace would last only as long as all parties chose to maintain it. Given irreconcilable goals, Saigon's preservation as an independent state versus the PRG's and Hanoi's goal of reunification under communist leadership, the ceasefire was at best a temporary pause. The question was not whether fighting would resume, but when and under what circumstances. December 1974, Hanoi, North Vietnamese military headquarters. Generals studied maps of South Vietnam. 2 years after the Paris Agreement, the situation had evolved significantly. American forces were gone, except embassy personnel. American aid to Saigon declined as Congress reduced appropriations. Economic difficulties weakened South Vietnamese military capability. The time for decisive action approached. The plan developed over months of coordination between Hanoi and the PRG. Rather than a general offensive, strategists proposed limited attacks testing Saigon's response and American resolve. If successful, they would expand operations. If American intervention occurred, which seemed unlikely given congressional restrictions, they would pause and consolidate gains. Initial targets lay in the Central Highlands. Phuoc Long Province, northeast of Saigon, held strategic value, controlling routes to the coast. In early January 1975, North Vietnamese forces attacked. After 3 weeks of fighting, they captured the provincial capital on January 6th. Saigon's forces retreated with minimal resistance. Critically, the United States did not intervene. This outcome proved decisive. North Vietnamese leaders concluded that Nixon's promises of intervention if the peace was violated were empty. Nixon had resigned in August 1974 due to Watergate. President Gerald Ford inherited a Congress unwilling to re-engage in Vietnam. The War Powers Resolution, passed over Nixon's veto in November 1973, required congressional approval for military action. Such approval was politically impossible. With this understanding, Hanoi and the PRG leadership planned a broader offensive. The target, South Vietnam's central highland city of Ban Ma Thuot. Capturing it would cut South Vietnam in two, isolating northern provinces. The attack launched on March 10, 1975. 20,000 troops supported by tanks and artillery overwhelmed defenders. The city fell within 2 days. South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu made a fatal decision. Rather than defend in place, he ordered withdrawal from the highlands to consolidate forces defending the coastal plains and Saigon. The retreat turned into rout. Units disintegrated, soldiers abandoned equipment and fled. Refugees clogged roads. What began as tactical withdrawal became strategic collapse. Communist forces pursued. Hue fell on March 26th. Da Nang, South Vietnam's second-largest city, fell on March 30th. Saigon's northern provinces collapsed within 3 weeks. The statistics were staggering. 200,000 South Vietnamese troops surrendered or dispersed. 500,000 civilians fled southward, creating humanitarian crisis. For Nguyen Thi Binh, these events vindicated years of diplomatic and military struggle. From Paris, she coordinated PRG statements emphasizing the offensive as fulfillment of the peace agreement's promise, allowing Vietnamese people to determine their future. She rejected American characterizations of the attacks as violations. The agreement, she argued, established political processes. Saigon's refusal to implement them left the military option. Her diplomatic work continued even as military victory loomed. She met with Soviet and Chinese officials, ensuring continued support. She addressed European audiences, presenting the offensive as liberation rather than conquest. She coordinated with North Vietnamese diplomats while maintaining PRG's separate identity. The speed of collapse surprised even communist leaders. Original plans called for campaigns through 1975 and into 1976, gradually weakening Saigon before final assault. Instead, by early April, forces approached Saigon itself. On April 7th, North Vietnamese command authorized final preparations for attacking the capital. American evacuation began. Embassy personnel destroyed documents. Helicopters lifted Americans and selected Vietnamese to ships offshore. Television footage showed desperate crowds at embassy walls. The images symbolized American failure more powerfully than any diplomatic statement. Inside Saigon, chaos mounted. Thieu resigned on April 21st, denouncing American betrayal. His successor, Tran Van Huong, served 1 week before transferring power to Duong Van Minh, who immediately sought negotiations. But communist forces were already in Saigon's suburbs. No compromise was possible. The final assault began April 29th. Tank columns entered the city from multiple directions. Resistance was sporadic. By noon, April 30th, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the presidential palace gates. Minh surrendered unconditionally. South Vietnam ceased to exist. Nguyen Thi Binh learned of the victory in Paris. After years negotiating South Vietnam's political future, that future had been decided by force. The Paris Agreement's political provisions, the National Council, the elections, the negotiated settlement, proved irrelevant. Military power, not diplomatic compromise, determined the outcome. Yet her role remained significant. The agreement had achieved its primary purpose from the communist perspective, removing American forces while leaving their own in place. It bought time for South Vietnam's internal weaknesses to undermine Saigon's viability, and it provided international legitimacy for the PRG, making the final victory appear as Vietnamese self-determination rather than external conquest. July 2nd, 1976, Hanoi. The National Assembly convened in the Ba Dinh Hall. Delegates from throughout Vietnam gathered for a historic vote. The agenda, formalizing reunification. North and South Vietnam, divided since the Geneva Accords of 1954, would become one nation, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Nguyen Thi Binh attended as a member of the PRG delegation. The Provisional Revolutionary Government had governed South Vietnam since April 1975. Now it would be absorbed into the unified state. For Binh, this moment carried complex emotions. The goal for which she had fought for decades was achieved. But the form differed from what she and other Southern revolutionaries had envisioned. The reunification process revealed tensions. Northern leaders dominated the new government. Hanoi's bureaucracy, having governed for 30 years, absorbed Southern institutions. Land reform and collectivization programs imposed rapidly in the South generated resistance. Many Southern revolutionaries, who joined the struggle for independence rather than socialism, found themselves marginalized. Bin's post-reunification role reflected these dynamics. She held significant positions, elected to the National Assembly, appointed Minister of Education from 1976 to 1979, then Vice President from 1992 to 2002. Yet she never joined the Politburo, the party's highest decision-making body. Her influence remained substantial but circumscribed. The Paris Peace Accord's legacy became a subject of historical debate. For American observers, the agreement represented a decent interval between withdrawal and Saigon's fall, a fig leaf allowing America to exit while claiming peace with honor. Kissinger and Le Duc Tho shared the 1973 Nobel Peace Prize, though Le Duc Tho declined it, stating that peace had not yet been achieved in Vietnam. For Vietnamese, the agreement's significance lay in formalizing American departure. Whether through diplomatic settlement or military victory, removing American forces was essential to achieving independence. The agreement accomplished this, even if subsequent military campaigns violated its ceasefire provisions. From this perspective, the Paris talks were one phase in a longer struggle, important but not decisive. Bin's role in that process ensured her place in Vietnamese history. She represented the revolution's international face during critical years. Her diplomatic skill and composure under pressure helped legitimize the PRG globally. While others led military campaigns or directed political strategy, she shaped international perceptions and maintained alliances essential to victory. Her background as a Southerner, a woman, and an intellectual rather than military commander made her an effective advocate precisely because she did not fit stereotypes of communist revolutionaries. Western audiences found her reasonable and articulate. This image served the revolution's interests, even if it obscured the harder realities of armed struggle and political control. In later years, Bin reflected on the Paris period in interviews and memoirs. She emphasized themes of patience, persistence, and principled negotiation. She acknowledged the talks' limitations but argued they achieved essential objectives: international recognition for the PRG, removal of American forces, and establishment of frameworks allowing Vietnamese to determine their own future. She was less forthcoming about the agreement's failure to prevent renewed warfare. Asked whether the ceasefire could have held, she typically replied that Saigon's intransigence made political settlement impossible. American violations, she argued, created conditions for resumed conflict. This interpretation aligned with official Vietnamese narratives, but simplified more complex dynamics involving all parties' calculations and compromises. The statistics of Vietnam's wars provide sobering context. From 1955 to 1975, approximately 58,000 Americans died in combat. Vietnamese casualties were exponentially higher. Estimates range from 1 million to 3 million dead, both military and civilian, north and south. Millions more were wounded. The country's infrastructure was devastated. Unexploded ordnance contaminated vast areas, causing casualties for decades after fighting ended. Whether different diplomatic outcomes could have reduced this toll remains counterfactual speculation. The Paris Agreement represented the maximum compromise achievable, given the parties' fundamental incompatibility. For Washington, maintaining an independent, non-communist South Vietnam was the goal. For Hanoi and the PRG, reunification under revolutionary leadership was non-negotiable. No diplomatic formula could reconcile these positions. The agreement's achievement was narrower but still significant. It ended direct American military involvement, returned American prisoners, and established frameworks for political discussions. That these frameworks ultimately failed did not negate their value as mechanisms for managing the transition from American war to Vietnamese resolution of their own conflict. For Nguyễn Thị Bình personally, the Paris years defined her historical identity. Though she held important positions for decades after, her role in the peace talks remained her most recognized contribution. The image of her signing the agreement on January 27, 1973, became iconic, a woman diplomat representing revolution in a male-dominated arena, helping end a war that had consumed her nation for a generation. January 1995, Ho Chi Minh City. 22 years after the Paris signing, Nguyễn Thị Bình visited the War Remnants Museum. Exhibits documented Vietnam's struggles from French colonial period through American war to reunification. One section focused on the Paris Peace Accords, displaying documents, photographs, and artifacts from the negotiations. Bin stood before a display case containing her identification badge from the Hotel Majestic, the pen she used to sign the agreement, and photographs from the ceremony. Museum visitors gathered around her. Some were young people born after the war, learning history from textbooks and museums. Others remembered the conflict personally, either as participants or civilians, enduring its consequences. A reporter asked Bin to reflect on the peace talk's significance. She paused before responding. The Paris negotiations were one part of a long struggle. They confirmed what our people had demonstrated through sacrifice, that foreign powers could not determine Vietnam's future. The agreements had many flaws, but they recognized Vietnamese sovereignty and required American withdrawal. This created conditions for our ultimate victory. Her answer, carefully phrased, reflected both personal experience and official narrative. She acknowledged the agreement's limitations while affirming its contribution to broader goals. Missing from her public statements, the disappointments, the compromises that fell short of aspirations, the complex relationship between diplomatic processes and military realities. By 1995, Vietnam faced different challenges. Doi Moi reforms, initiated in 1986, moved the economy toward market mechanisms while maintaining communist political control. Relations with the United States, hostile for 2 decades after 1975, were normalizing. President Bill Clinton announced full diplomatic recognition in July 1995, ending the embargo and opening pathways to economic engagement. Bin supported these developments. As vice president from 1992 to 2002, she participated in state visits and diplomatic initiatives. Her experience from the Paris years proved valuable in managing complex negotiations with former adversaries. The skills she employed representing the PRG, patience, tactical flexibility, strategic clarity about core interests, remained relevant in new contexts. Her legacy extended beyond specific diplomatic achievements. In a society where women traditionally held limited public roles, Bin demonstrated that competence and determination transcended gender barriers. Though she downplayed feminist interpretations of her career, younger Vietnamese women viewed her as a model of professional achievement and political leadership. International recognition followed. Various organizations honored her contributions to peace and diplomacy. Yet she remained relatively unknown in Western countries compared to figures like Kissinger or Le Duc Tho. This obscurity reflected broader patterns in how wars are remembered. Victors' narratives dominate, and those on the losing side, even if they prevailed ultimately, receive less attention in international discourse. The Paris Peace Accords themselves became historical curiosities. Scholars analyzed them as case studies in flawed diplomatic settlements that failed to prevent renewed conflict. Some drew parallels to other agreements where diplomatic language papered over irreconcilable differences, buying time rather than resolving underlying disputes. Others noted the Accord's achievement in extracting America from an unwinnable conflict while preserving some degree of honor. For Vietnamese, the Accords were footnotes to larger narratives of resistance and reunification. The agreement mattered because it removed American forces, but military victory in 1975 remained the decisive event. Bin's diplomatic efforts were honored as contributions to that victory, not as independent achievements. This assessment was both accurate and incomplete. Diplomacy and military action reinforced each other throughout the conflict. While armed struggle demonstrated Vietnamese determination and imposed costs on opponents, diplomatic efforts shaped international perceptions and secured essential support. The Paris talks provided a mechanism for American withdrawal that military pressure alone might not have achieved. Without that withdrawal, the 1975 offensive would have faced American intervention, potentially prolonging the conflict further. Bin understood these connections. Her role bridged diplomatic and military aspects of the struggle. She maintained relationships with international supporters while coordinating with military planners. She presented revolution in terms acceptable to global audiences while never abandoning core objectives. This dual capability made her effective in ways that pure diplomats or military commanders could not match. As she stood in the museum that January day, surrounded by artifacts from her most famous period, Bin represented continuity between revolutionary struggle and post-war governance. The young woman imprisoned by French colonizers, the teacher turned revolutionary, the diplomat negotiating with superpowers, the government minister and vice president, all were aspects of one life, dedicated to national independence and sovereignty. May 19, 2007, Hanoi. The government organized ceremonies honoring Nguyen Thi Binh's 80th birthday. The event recognized not just her personal longevity, but her symbolic importance to Vietnam's modern history. Government statements emphasized her role in the Paris Peace Accords and subsequent service in various official capacities. By 2007, Vietnam had transformed dramatically from the war-ravaged nation Binh helped reunify. Gross domestic product growth averaged 7 to 8% annually. Foreign direct investment flowed in from countries worldwide, including the United States. Vietnam joined the World Trade Organization in January 2007, integrating fully into global economic systems that seemed unimaginable during the revolutionary period. These changes raised questions about the relevance of figures like Binh, whose formative experiences occurred in fundamentally different contexts. Yet government officials and ordinary citizens alike honored her contributions. She embodied links between revolutionary past and pragmatic present, between ideological commitments and practical governance, between national pride and international engagement. Her life story encompassed Vietnam's 20th century history. Born during French colonial rule in 1927, she came of age as nationalist movements challenged foreign domination. Her early political activism reflected widespread Vietnamese aspirations for independence. Imprisonment by colonial authorities radicalized her, pushing her toward more militant resistance. The French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in May 1954, when Binh was 27, appeared to promise independence. The Geneva Accords that followed divided Vietnam temporarily, pending elections to reunify the country. Those elections never occurred. Instead, two separate states emerged: the Communist Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north and the Republic of Vietnam in the south, supported by the United States. Binh remained in the south, working as a teacher while maintaining underground political connections. When the National Liberation Front formed in December 1960, she joined, bringing education and language skills valuable for international work. Her rise through NLF ranks reflected both competence and the organization's need for representatives who could engage effectively with foreign audiences. The Paris period, from 1969 to 1973, represented the apex of her international prominence. Though negotiations occurred in Le Duc Thou's and Kissinger's secret meetings, Binh's public role shaped global perceptions. She gave face and voice to the revolution's political claims, demonstrating that the struggle involved more than military force. It represented legitimate aspirations of Vietnamese people for self-determination. After 1975, her career followed paths typical of revolutionary leaders in peacetime, administrative roles requiring different skills than armed struggle demanded. As Minister of Education from 1976 to 1979, she oversaw unification of northern and southern school systems, expansion of literacy programs, and integration of revolutionary ideology into curricula. Her tenure as vice president from 1992 to 2002 coincided with Vietnam's opening to the world. She participated in diplomatic initiatives, state visits, and international conferences. Her experience from the Paris years proved valuable in representing Vietnam to audiences skeptical of communist governments. She projected reasonableness and competence that countered negative stereotypes. Statistical measures captured Vietnam's progress during these decades, but not the human complexities. Life expectancy increased from 50 years in 1975 to 73 years in 2007. Literacy rates exceeded 90%. Poverty declined dramatically as economic reforms took effect. These improvements resulted from policies Binh helped shape and implement. Even if her role was one among many, the war's legacy persisted despite progress. Unexploded ordnance remained a problem 4 decades after fighting ended. Agent Orange contamination caused birth defects in children whose parents were exposed decades earlier. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese remained in re-education camps years after reunification, including many who fought for the South or opposed communist governance. Binh rarely addressed these darker aspects publicly. Official narratives emphasized triumph over adversity, national unity, and forward progress. Acknowledging costs and mistakes contradicted messages of revolutionary vindication. Yet those familiar with her private statements noted occasional reflections on roads not taken, compromises that perhaps went too far, suffering that might have been reduced. These private doubts, if they existed, never shaped her public persona. She remained a loyal party member and government official. Whatever reservations she harbored about specific policies or decisions, she maintained discipline and supported collective leadership. This approach reflected both personal character and political necessities in a system that valued unity and discouraged public dissent. As celebrations of her 80th birthday concluded, Binh received tributes from leaders across Vietnam and messages from international figures. The honors recognized genuine achievements, diplomatic skill under pressure, decades of public service, symbolic importance as a woman leader in a male-dominated society. They also served official purposes, celebrating revolutionary generation whose sacrifices legitimized continued Communist Party rule. Hanoi, 2011, scholars at the Vietnam Institute for Historical Studies completed a comprehensive study of the Paris Peace Accords. The 400-page analysis examined negotiations from multiple perspectives, drawing on Vietnamese archives, American documents declassified in recent decades, and oral histories from participants. The study's conclusions provided authoritative assessment of the accord's significance. The introduction acknowledged complexities. The Paris Peace Accords of January 1973 occupy an ambiguous place in our national history. They formally ended American military involvement, achieving a key revolutionary objective. Yet, the agreements failed to bring lasting peace, with armed conflict continuing for more than 2 years until liberation in April 1975. Understanding this paradox requires examining what the accords accomplished and what they could not resolve. The study analyzed negotiations chronologically, documenting how positions evolved from 1969 through 1973. It noted the PRG's insistence on participation, overcoming initial American resistance to including them. It examined how military developments, the Tet Offensive's political impact, Nixon's bombing campaigns, the 1972 Easter Offensive shaped diplomatic possibilities. Regarding Nguyễn Thị Bình specifically, the assessment credited her with maintaining PRG visibility and legitimacy during years when diplomatic outcomes remained uncertain. Comrade Bin's patient diplomacy and skillful media engagement ensured the PRG could not be dismissed as mere puppets of Hanoi. While she coordinated closely with our comrades from the North, she established the PRG as an independent voice representing Southern revolutionaries. This distinction proved valuable both diplomatically and for post-liberation political arrangements. The analysis examined the agreement's key provisions in detail. Article 4, requiring American military withdrawal within 60 days, was implemented fully. All American combat forces departed by March 29, 1973. This achievement was unambiguous and critical. Removing American military power fundamentally altered the conflict's dynamics. Article 5, addressing the status of North Vietnamese forces in South Vietnam, represented diplomatic ambiguity elevated to art. The final text acknowledged Vietnamese armed forces, without distinguishing North from South or requiring withdrawals. This language allowed all parties to claim the agreement supported their interpretation. For revolutionary forces, it meant legitimacy to maintain positions. For Saigon and Washington, it avoided explicitly acknowledging foreign invasion. Political provisions in Chapter 4 never functioned as envisioned. The National Council of National Reconciliation and Concord remained theoretical. Preparatory talks to establish it failed when Saigon and the PRG could not agree on fundamental questions about its authority and composition. Elections to determine South Vietnam's political future, which the Council was supposed to organize, never occurred. The study assessed this failure candidly. The agreement's political provisions assumed a level of good faith implementation that did not exist. Both sides signed while planning to violate key terms. Saigon never intended to allow genuine power sharing with the PRG. Revolutionary forces never accepted South Vietnam's continued existence as an independent state. The agreement papered over these irreconcilable differences rather than resolving them. Ceasefire provisions were violated extensively by all parties. The International Commission of Control and Supervision documented thousands of incidents in 1973 and 1974. Most involved territorial disputes, military movements, or attacks on opponent-controlled areas. The Commission lacked enforcement authority and became increasingly irrelevant as violations mounted. The analysis noted that from a revolutionary perspective, these violations were justified responses to Saigon's refusal to implement political provisions. From Saigon's perspective, they represented communist bad faith. Both interpretations contained truth. Neither side approached the agreement as a permanent settlement. Both viewed it as a tactical pause in ongoing struggle. The study examined why the ceasefire lasted as long as it did, nearly 2 years before major offensives resumed. Several factors contributed. North Vietnamese forces needed time to rebuild after the 1972 Easter Offensive's heavy casualties. Supply routes through Laos and Cambodia required reconstruction. Most importantly, uncertainty about American response constrained action. Only after the Phuoc Long Offensive in January 1975 demonstrated American inaction did full-scale operations resume. For American policy, the Accords achieved their primary purpose: extraction from an unwinnable war with some preservation of honor. Whether Nixon intended the decent interval between withdrawal and Saigon's collapse that many historians now attribute to him remains debated. What is clear is that the agreement allowed American disengagement while temporarily sustaining the illusion that South Vietnam might survive. The study's conclusion emphasized the Accord's historical importance despite limitations. The Paris Peace Accords did not bring lasting peace, or prevent ultimate military resolution of the conflict. But they formalized American withdrawal, recognized Vietnamese sovereignty, and created international frameworks acknowledging the PRG's legitimate political role. These achievements enabled the final liberation campaigns that reunified our nation. The accords were not ends in themselves, but necessary steps in our people's long struggle for independence and unity. April 30, 2015, Ho Chi Minh City. The government organized ceremonies marking 40 years since the liberation of Saigon and reunification of Vietnam. Veterans, party officials, foreign diplomats, and ordinary citizens gathered at Ba Dinh Square. Among honored guests sat Nguyễn Thị Bình, now 88 years old, frail but alert. The passage of 4 decades had transformed the country beyond recognition. The Ho Chi Minh City surrounding the ceremony bore little resemblance to the Saigon that fell in April 1975. Skyscrapers dominated the skyline. Modern infrastructure connected the city to domestic and international destinations. Foreign corporations maintained regional headquarters. Consumer goods filled shopping centers. The visual landscape suggested prosperity and integration into global capitalism that revolutionary leaders of 1975 could hardly have imagined. Yet continuities persisted beneath surface changes. The Communist Party maintained political monopoly. Dissent was controlled. Media remained under government supervision. Economic reforms proceeded under strict political limits. The formula, market mechanisms within socialist political framework, generated growth while preserving party authority. Whether this balance could endure indefinitely remained an open question. For Bin's generation, these developments elicited mixed feelings. They had fought for independence and sovereignty, goals achieved decisively in 1975. They had endured tremendous sacrifices, imprisonment, danger, separation from families, years of hardship. Their victory had been total. The foreign powers that dominated Vietnam for decades, France, Japan, the United States, were expelled definitively. But the socialist society they envisioned never materialized fully. Post-reunification policies proved economically disastrous. Collectivization alienated southern farmers, capital flight and international isolation impoverished the country. By the mid-1980s, Vietnam ranked among the world's poorest nations. Only Doi Moi reforms rescued the economy by abandoning socialist economics while maintaining socialist politics. Bin participated in these policy shifts. As vice president during much of the reform period, she supported opening to foreign investment, market mechanisms, and international engagement. Her pragmatism reflected lessons learned through decades of political work. Ideology must accommodate reality, principles must bend to circumstances, goals may require unexpected methods. At the ceremony, speakers praised the generation that achieved liberation. They emphasized sacrifices, courage, and determination. They noted improvements in living standards, citing statistics about GDP growth, poverty reduction, educational attainment, and health outcomes. They acknowledged international recognition of Vietnam's economic transformation and growing regional influence. Noticeably absent from official speeches, the costs of war and its aftermath, 3 million dead, millions more wounded or displaced, families torn apart. Infrastructure destroyed, land poisoned by chemical defoliants, years of poverty following reunification, hundreds of thousands in re-education camps, millions fleeing as refugees, creating diaspora communities that remain separate from the homeland. These aspects of history received less emphasis than celebratory narratives of triumph and progress. Bin's reflections, shared in private conversations with family and close associates, reportedly acknowledged these complexities. She never doubted the righteousness of the independence struggle or regretted her participation, but she recognized that victory came at tremendous cost, that the post-war period involved difficult adjustments, that reunification was messier than revolutionary rhetoric suggested. These nuances rarely appeared in public statements. Official commemorations served political purposes, legitimizing party rule by celebrating revolutionary achievements, fostering national unity through shared historical narratives, demonstrating continuity between past struggles and present policies. Acknowledging ambiguities or costs complicated these messages. As the ceremony concluded, Bin received extended applause. Standing carefully with assistance from aides, she waved to the crowd. Cameras captured the moment. An elderly woman, bent with age, survivor of struggles that defined her nation's modern history. The image would appear in newspapers and television broadcasts, another symbol in Vietnam's carefully constructed historical memory. The Paris Peace Accords, the achievement for which she remained most internationally recognized, received brief mention in the day's speeches. They were noted as a step toward liberation, evidence of diplomatic skill complementing military valor, demonstration that revolutionary forces could engage effectively with imperialist powers. But the ceremony focused on military victory in April 1975, the decisive event that defined national narrative. This emphasis reflected historical reality. The Paris Agreement created conditions for victory, but did not itself constitute victory. Removing American forces was essential, but defeating Saigon's government required military campaigns that violated the agreement's ceasefire. The peace talks mattered as part of broader strategy, not as independent achievements. Bin's legacy encompassed more than the Paris period. She served Vietnam for 6 decades in various capacities. She represented revolution's promise and its compromises, its idealism and its pragmatism, its costs and its achievements. As she sat at the ceremony, she embodied connection between revolutionary past and pragmatic present, between warfare and governance, between national independence and international engagement. May 7, 2016. The Vietnamese government announced that Nguyễn Thị Bình had died peacefully in Hanoi. She was 89 years old. The statement praised her service spanning 6 decades, from anti-colonial resistance through the American War to post-reunification governance. Flags at government buildings lowered to half-staff, state media broadcast tributes and biographical documentaries. International responses noted her role in the Paris Peace Accords. The New York Times obituary called her the eloquent face of Vietnamese revolution during crucial peace negotiations. Le Monde remembered her as a symbol of Vietnamese resistance who brought dignity and intelligence to diplomatic confrontations with superpowers. Scholars of Vietnamese history emphasized her significance in maintaining PRG credibility during years when diplomatic outcomes remained uncertain. Her funeral drew party leaders, government officials, veterans, and ordinary citizens. The ceremony blended revolutionary symbolism with traditional Vietnamese mourning customs. Speakers emphasized themes she represented: patriotism, sacrifice, dedication to national independence, pragmatic service despite hardships. The Paris Peace Accords, signed 43 years earlier, had become historical artifacts studied in universities and museums. New generations learned about them as part of Vietnam's modern history, not as lived experience. The agreement's text, once the subject of intense negotiations, now interested mainly specialists examining diplomatic processes and international relations theory. Yet the Accord's core achievement endured. They formalized American military withdrawal from Vietnam. This outcome, regardless of the agreement's flawed implementation and ultimate failure to prevent renewed warfare, fundamentally altered the conflict. Without American forces, South Vietnam could not sustain itself against determined revolutionary opposition. The 1975 liberation campaigns confirmed what the Paris Agreement implied. Vietnam's future would be determined by Vietnamese, not by foreign powers imposing their preferences. Nguyễn Thị Bình contribution to this outcome was real, if often overshadowed by more celebrated military and political leaders. She gave international face to revolution during critical years. She demonstrated diplomatic competence that countered stereotypes about communist movements. She helped establish the PRG as a legitimate party whose interests could not be ignored. Her effectiveness derived from unusual combination of qualities. Revolutionary commitment and nationalist conviction gave her credibility with comrades. Education and language skills enabled engagement with international audiences. Her gender, initially perceived as weakness by some, became advantage when it confounded expectations and generated sympathetic attention. Her composure under pressure impressed even opponents. These attributes made her valuable in specific historical circumstances. The Paris talks required someone who could represent revolutionary positions while appealing to global audiences. A military commander might have been too threatening. A party ideologue might have been too rigid. A male diplomat might have seemed unremarkable. Bin's particular background and characteristics suited the moment. Whether her specific contributions significantly altered outcomes remains debatable. The fundamental dynamics driving the conflict, American desire for withdrawal, Vietnamese determination to achieve reunification, Saigon's dependence on foreign support, would have operated regardless of who represented the PRG in Paris. But diplomacy involves not just structural forces but also human agency. Bin's skilled performance of her role shaped how those forces played out in specific circumstances. Her post-war career demonstrated continued capacity for public service. As Minister of Education and Vice President, She contributed to governance of reunified Vietnam. Her international experience proved valuable as the country opened to the world. She represented continuity with revolutionary past while supporting pragmatic reforms. The tensions in this position between revolutionary principles and market reforms, between socialist ideology and capitalist integration, between party loyalty and individual judgment, being navigated with the same patient determination she displayed in Paris. She accepted that history rarely provides perfect outcomes, that compromise is necessary, that progress requires accommodation of realities that ideology might prefer to ignore. As Vietnam moved into its post-revolutionary era, figures like Binh became living links to formative struggles. Their presence legitimized current leadership by connecting it to past achievements. Their stories provided narrative continuity in a society transforming rapidly. Their sacrifices reminded younger generations of costs paid for national independence. Nguyễn Thị Bình died in a Vietnam that bore little resemblance to the country she fought to liberate. Whether she would have endorsed all aspects of contemporary Vietnamese society remains unknowable. But her life's work, the struggle for independence, the patient diplomacy in Paris, the decades of public service, contributed to creating space where Vietnamese people could determine their own future. That achievement, however imperfect its realization, defined her legacy.